there, this is Keith, coming at you before the intro music. So, funny story about this podcast. I actually recorded it last Wednesday, or recorded it in 3 segments last Wednesday, and then thought to myself, as I so often do, wait a minute, that's not perfect. I'm not sure that I want to release that. I'm not sure what I said. Should this even be a podcast? Well, of course, I had then planned to re-record it this week, and as luck would have it, I both have a cold/con crud from attending Dragon Con this weekend, and there is a beeping lift around my apartment building as they start to paint. So I can't re-record it this week. This is great, because it means I actually have to edit together what I initially set out to say last week, put it into podcast form, and release it. I hope you enjoy it. If you absolutely hate it and you think I was a fool for releasing it, feel free to send some feedback. You can send it to yourpodcastsucked@thisadhdlife.com, or if you don't want to be so confrontational, info@thisadhdlife.com. I hope you enjoy what I recorded last week. I hope I recorded what I enjoyed last week, and I will be talking to you in a couple weeks. Thanks for listening. Welcome to This ADHD Life, the podcast for people with ADHD, those who love them, and yes, even those who sometimes struggle to love them. Yes, indeed. Welcome back to ADHD. I can't even say my own podcast name. Yes, indeed. Welcome back to This ADHD Life. I am Coach Keith, and I apologize for not having recorded a podcast in the past 6 months. You know, it's funny. I could give you a bunch of excuses, and hey, that's exactly what I'll do. I don't know if they're excuses, but there are reasons for sure. One is that it seems like the longer that I went without recording a podcast, the more downloads my previous podcasts got. Now, I'd say this peak of interest probably peaked in about May, so that gives me a few months of leeway there. But it was really an interesting trend. Like every week I would have 100 new downloads, and then the next week it would be 200 or 300 new downloads, and it just kind of exponentially grew from there. And I kind of wanted to see how long the experiment would last. But it's August 30th as I record this, and I said, Keith, you will have a podcast out by August 31st, or during August 31st, because that's what's going to happen. Spoiler alert, it didn't happen. I titled this episode More Confessions of an ADHD Mind because even though I'm an ADHD coach, I also am a person affected with ADHD, and whether or not you want to call it a disorder or a strength or a skill set or whatever, there are still some downsides to it, and there's a lot of upsides to it too, but we can get into this sort of pattern of not doing something so often that just stops getting done, and that sort of happened here with the podcast. The other thing that happened, and I realized this earlier today, is that I had been, and if you've been listening to the podcast since its inception last year, you've heard me talk about this before, but I still struggle with the idea of what is this show meant to be, and how much structure does it need? How much preparation does it need? Does it need an outline? And I was thinking this morning, after talking to a client of mine, about how I used to do public speaking in high school. I don't think I've told this story before, but if I have, stop me. Well, no, don't stop me. Just fast forward through. In high school, I took a public speaking class, and I actually did very well. I wasn't a great student in general, but that year, I think it was my junior year, I did phenomenally well in public speaking. And the key to my success back then was not preparing speeches. And in fact, when final exam time came around, it might have been a mid-year exam came around, the teacher said to me, Keith, you have got to write a speech and hand it in to me and then do your speech before I will pass you. Like, this is just the order of operations. This is what must be done. She came to me and said, this was like a C speech at best, maybe a D. I'll give you a B because I kind of screwed you up here. Like, you should have just followed your own flow. And the interesting part about this, to me at least, is how doing a podcast isn't that much different than public speaking. Everybody that does a podcast has their own level of preparation and their own level of show notes and outline and guest notes and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And just because I might want to just do it with a very minimal outline, this one is in my head, which probably a bad plan because I have ADHD and I'll probably forget half of it by the time I'm through recording. But what I realized this morning is what I need to do to make this podcast, to make this microphone a little bit less scary for me, is to just come record. And maybe even start streaming my recordings live once in a while, because that will help me with accountability. If people are expecting a stream from me at a certain time, helps with accountability. But in a way, there feels like a disconnect between live and on tape, that somehow, because this isn't even on tape, because this is going on to the SSD of my Mac, that it has to be somehow more professional or more polished than a live stream. And indeed, if you've been watching any of the Houston news coverage this week, and just confession time here, I probably have watched more Houston news coverage than I've actually slept this past week. This sort of stuff is fascinating to me. One of the reasons is I actually lived in Houston, and last night, one of the areas they were in, I used to pass through all the time when getting from my house to one particular shopping mall. And even the Weather Channel yesterday had a camera trained on the brick wall that was the brick wall to the subdivision I used to live in. And so that was fascinating to me. And in general, it's sort of like this intense dopamine rush of just getting constant new information. If you're somewhat news addicted, as I can tend to be, like, you're constantly refreshing your feed. Like, what's happened here? What's going on with the political campaign? What's going on with the protests around the country? What's going on with North Korea? What's going on here, there, and the other thing? And if it's not news, maybe you're addicted to like celebrity stuff or Facebook or something like that. And I use the term addicted loosely. It's something that you can train yourself away from. And by the way, for myself, I've actually trained myself away from Facebook over the past couple months. Life is so much better when you're not comparing yourself to the people posting only the positive aspects on your newsfeed. But the Houston news coverage just fascinated me from a number of different perspectives. But if you have actually been watching the Houston news coverage, you know the majority of it is live. There's actually that poor woman that was cussing on TV because she didn't want cameras in her face, and I totally get that. But the quality of the live feed is so different than the polished pieces that news stations put together. And it's the same with internet video. If you look at people who are streaming on YouTube Live or Periscope versus the content creators, a lot of times the polished stuff is pre-recorded. And yeah, there are streams out there that definitely have a more polished look than others. But there's a fun with recording live, and there's a fun with watching live as well. And I've realized that is something that I very much want to take a hold of in the future. It's what interests me. And that speaks to something else. I just wasn't interested in recording the podcast for a while. I already talked about a little bit why. Like, I felt like there was a whole bunch more preparation that I needed to do before I could actually do a podcast. When would enough be enough? Exactly how much do I have to prepare? Is there a certain number of words I have to do? Certain level of outline? Is there a mind map I got to do? Is there pages? What's the requirement, Keith, to just sit down and record a podcast? Well, the answer is there's none. And I face this challenge a lot in my own life, and my clients face it, and fellow ADHDers that I talk to, and friends. And, you don't even have to have ADHD. There's this like level of I have to get to here before I will actually start something, or something will be completed. In fact, one of the reasons that some people procrastinate, there's a few different reasons why you procrastinate. One of them, you get to almost the finish point, but you don't want to finish it because it's not perfect. I'd say that's probably a good part of my procrastination. The other reason is I massively overestimate the time that it's going to actually take for me to do any one task. So, I'll sit down and go, oh man, this terrible task is going to take 2 hours. I sit down and do it, and it takes like 10 minutes. Do you identify with this at all? I don't know. But I had set up all these little gates that I had to do certain things in order to be able to have a podcast, and in order to be able to buy a Chromebook. This past June, I bought a new Chromebook for my business, and Man, that was an interesting experiment in decision making. By the way, I got rid of my iPad as well in the process, and that's something that I thought I would have forever. I could not picture Coach Keith Griffin without an iPad. I've been iPad free for a couple months, which is crazy. So how does this apply to life? My argument is that if you're this way in one area, you're probably this way in a lot of different areas. And, here's the question is, what do you have to have before you start living a great life, before you live the fulfilling life that you want? So many times these days we get trapped in the making of more money, purchasing of more things, status trap, making sure we have the latest fashion, making sure we're eating at the trendiest restaurants, buying the organic, nuts, berries, coffee, and grass seeds for our lawn. Organic grass seeds for our lawn. I don't know if it exists, but I have a feeling it probably does. And if it doesn't, whoever you are listening to this show, starting that up as a startup, contact me. I'd like 1% of your company. So if I can just sit here and stop myself from recording a podcast for 6 odd months, imagine what I can stop myself from doing that is more serious than a podcast, that isn't really something I can live without. And the thing is, time and time again, I get the same type of stuff reflected back to me in coaching sessions. The idea that, well, I can't do that because I haven't saved up enough, or I can't do this because then it's to the exclusion of this, or, I can't have my happiness because I still have kids at home. Really? That doesn't seem very, very good. So why am I recording this podcast for you? You're probably sitting there going, man, I tuned into an ADHD podcast. I'm looking for some tips. The reason is companionship right now. The reason is some camaraderie. When I make calls for the Attention Deficit Disorder Association, of which I am a member, a volunteer as an ambassador, and a board member, so many times when I speak to people, they haven't heard someone that has ADHD sort of in the flesh, really. I talked to a woman today, actually, that had requested a call, and she's wondering whether or not she wants to come to our conference. Was talking about whether she has the courage to come to the conference. And it was striking because we instantly developed a rapport. It's almost like our ADHD mind started to sync up a little bit. But she expressed that, wow, I don't really talk to that many ADHD people. And that's the purpose of this particular podcast recording, is to let you know there are people out there. The other is to say, hey, welcome to all the people that are now subscribing as a result of my ad in Attitude magazine. I saw my downloads really spike in the beginning of August, and so there are new listeners, and I feel definitely accountable to you to putting these out every couple weeks. We're going into an awareness month pretty soon. And my plan is to put out a podcast a week during Awareness Month. No idea what it's going to look like, no idea of the quality. What I do know is that I'm going to try to hold myself accountable for minimal planning. Because if I don't, then you will never get anything, any podcasts again. I mean, that's just the fact. But if you identify with anything that I have just said, anything that I have recorded today, and you're looking for camaraderie and just knowing that other people feel the way you do, act the way you do, have put their keys in their fridge. That's the famous joke, but, have actively procrastinated about going to Dragon Con, even though they told their spouse a year ago they would go because you're so afraid of crowds. You've procrastinated on doing that. Guilty? Then this podcast is for you. If that's not you, and I don't know, you want to keep listening, that's awesome. I'd love it. If you have feedback, send feedback to info@thisadhdlife.com. So with the whys, whats, and hows out of the way, here's a little update. Happy to announce that I am now an ICF accredited life coach. They don't actually accredit ADHD coaches. They used to, but no longer. Doesn't mean much in terms of... Well, I really shouldn't say that, right? But it really applies to people hiring corporate clients and whatnot. And it is an important designator. I shouldn't say it doesn't mean much because it definitely does mean a lot. But there are good coaches that aren't ICF credentialed. There are bad coaches that are ICF credentialed. It is one way for you to know whether or not you're getting an ADHD coach who has gone through what they need to do to earn that credential. But as I've said in the past, you always want to interview your coach before you sign a coaching agreement because not everybody's personality fits with that. Aside from that and the sort of excuses or reasons I listed before, I have to admit life has been very busy. Back when I was in coaching school back in 2016, I thought, hey, I'll launch a podcast and I'll certainly have enough time to do coaching school and the podcast and launch my business. And then I'll also volunteer for ADA. And by the way, I volunteered for an organization called the ADHD Coaches Organization for a while this year. And I'll have time to sort of be the house husband because I take care of all the medical appointments and vet appointments and groceries and when they come in to install fiber optic TV service, which they did last week, and oh my God, was that a disaster? But still, I'm the one that takes care of all that. And I thought to myself, Keith, you have this 28 hours worth of stuff that'll probably take you 30 because remember, time and sensitivity. So if you can just do those 30 hours of stuff in a 24-hour day, you're all set. Yeah, that's the problem with the plan. So I've been busy doing that. I'm coming back to doing the podcast now. I have a little bit more excitement about it, a little bit more interest, and definitely have some plans for the future on how to expand and maybe offer some tips. I had mentioned before I had struggled to figure out what exactly this podcast looks like. I didn't want it to be the standard ADHD two-person show where you have an interviewer, an interviewee that provides tips and whatnot. I didn't want to come across as an expert, though I do like to share stuff from time to time. For example, one of the things that I've been doing lately is to drink a boatload of water. Yeah, that's a poor pun given I was talking about Houston earlier. But I've been drinking a ton more water lately because if you're on an ADHD medication, and by the way, during the entire time that I was not doing podcasts, I was also switching ADHD medications. But I finally found a combination that works for me, which is great. It's kind of like going in and buying a new pair of jeans, right? You go to the store and there's like skinny, boot cut, athletic fit, stretch, regular fit, extra regular fit, comfy, super comfy, and like nude jeans these days. Like, how do you even choose between that, right? But ADHD medication can be the same way, where it's just going to take a while to experiment before you get stuff done, or you really get to the optimal dosage for you. So if you're on an ADHD medication, you get dehydrated more because your blood pressure can tend to go up and your heart races a little bit more, and you tend to be more active than when you're off an ADHD medication. And one of the things that can really help your ADHD, believe it or not, is drinking a ton of water because it flushes certain toxins and stuff like that. I can't stand that I just said toxins, but it's true. It flushes the body's waste out of the body. And I have noticed since I've started to really try to get in 64 ounces, that's about a gallon a day of water or more, that my head is clearer and I actually just feel better and my skin is clearer. So if you're looking for a tip, there's your tip. Go write that down. Drink more water. I'm not going to tell you how to do it other than to just do it. The way I do it is I have a little bit of a reminder in my phone to check every few hours whether or not the giant Marvin the Martian mug I have is empty. And if it's not, I drink the water and then I go refill it. And that's what works for me. It might work for you. Different people use different things. I've seen posts on Weight Watchers. I'm a member of Weight Watchers, where people will put a rubber band, a certain like 8 rubber bands on their glass, and they peel one off every time they drink a cup of water. And that's how they keep track. But if you're on ADHD medication, even if you're not, I almost guarantee you're not drinking enough water. I'm not saying that you need to be one of those people that goes out with, a canteen every time you go out just to the grocery store. But if you do start incorporating more water, you might be surprised at what sort of benefits it has. I thank you for downloading and listening to this episode of This ADHD Life. I have a bunch of new ideas to come, both in show titles. I mean, I have to tell you that at one point in my life, I was going to become a blogger, and I opened up my Evernote the other day because I'm trying to figure out how I want to use Evernote, and don't get me started on Evernote, but I found this notebook called Blog Posts, and there's like 300 different ideas I had. So I'm very good at having the ideas and even storing them. I'm not necessarily so great at retrieving the ideas. The great thing is for me that now I have this sort of well that I can tap, water pun, this well that I can tap and actually start pulling out shows. So I don't have to try to think of something every single week or couple weeks to put on the air, so to speak. But thank you for tuning in. If you're not a subscriber and you're fresh to this podcast, please go subscribe. If you enjoyed the content here, if you've been enjoying the previous shows, please go to iTunes and leave a review. It helps people know that you like the content and might bring this content to this podcast to more ears that could benefit from its publication. You can always visit me at thisadhdlife.com to send feedback, to learn about some live stuff that I'm going to be doing. I'm putting together a bit of a group coaching program, I think, at some point. So thisadhdlife.com is there. And I did mention that we're having an ADHD conference here in Atlanta. So the past couple of years, I went to the CHAD conference. CHAD, for those new to the show, is really more about children than adults with ADHD. ADA, the organization I volunteer with, is for adults. Although we have dabble in children, just like CHAD dabbles in adults. We have combined forces, and we're having this one big mega conference, so big that it's like literally called the International Conference on ADHD. It's in my backyard. It's happening November 9th through the 12th, I believe. And I would love to see you there. I'll be there, maybe in a This ADHD Life t-shirt, maybe in a polo shirt. I haven't decided yet. But for more information on that, you can go to the ADA website at add.org, and you'll just see a banner right there where you click. And you can join us at the conference. Thank you for listening again. I will talk to you in a couple weeks. I hope you have a great Labor Day weekend if you're listening before the weekend. And I hope you had a great Labor Day weekend if you are listening after the weekend. So obviously you're listening after Labor Day weekend. I hope it was great. And I hope you had both a great and a great Labor Day weekend if you've listened twice, once before and once afterwards. I'll catch you next time. My name is Coach Keith. Have a great couple of weeks.